Hello and welcome everybody to the online roundtable discussion, Aging Buildings, Aging Bodies. My name is Gabriela Nicolescu. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography, University of Oxford. Together with Maria Șalaru, lecturer in anthropology at University College London, we have put together a series of 3 events for the London Festival of Architecture, at the invitation of the Romanian Cultural Institute in London and with the participation of the Municipality Museum in Bucharest. Thank you for coming. This roundtable is the concluding event. Hopefully you will enjoy the fact that together with our invited speakers, we want to reflect on the relationship between built environments and people's aging bodies, and on various practices of care for and care about both people and buildings. There is a current need of contextualization and theorization around the concept of care, and the scale of our discussions will vary from personal care to familial environments to community, neighborhood, or state. The roundtable discussion is going to consist of 4 presentations of 9, maximum 10 minutes each, followed by a short discussion. The first speaker is Daniela Calciu. She's an architect at the University of Architecture in Bucharest with expertise in architecture and contemporary arts. I am an anthropologist doing research with social data and artifacts and images. I am a curator as well. Iulia Stătică is an architect and a filmmaker at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. Our 4th speaker, Maria Șalaru, is an anthropologist and a filmmaker at UCL. And last but not least, we are very happy to have with us Hannah Knox, who agreed to be a discussant. She's an anthropologist at UCL. So all 4 speakers have as a starting point of their research and films, research done in socialist blocks of flats built in socialist Romania in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. When they were built, these blocks had multiple functions. They were affordable. In theory, they allowed housing for all, but in practice, that was not always the case. And they function as social condensers or social mixers. They were a symbol of social leveling. The doctor lived in the same block with the nurse, with the worker, with the policeman, the teacher, etc. Meanwhile, the first generation of those who moved inside of these blocks became old, and a change of regime occurred, which is very important to discuss. And blocks transformed as well as the people inhabiting them. So what happens to these people who now are old? And what happens to these blocks that were built and they were inhabited very often in connections with ideas of property. So this is very interesting that the Romanian examples are very much in connection with these ideas of people having the property of the flats they inhabit. So we will start the conversation now with our first participant, Daniela Calciu, who is assistant professor at Mincu University of Architecture and Urbanism in Bucharest and Director of Development at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest. Daniela's work is to set the museum's public service and outreach programs. As both a faculty member of the School of Architecture and a member of the Association of Urban Transition since 2007, Daniela is working to turn students into activists motivated to empower citizens to engage with transformative processes of their neighborhood. So my question for Daniela as a starting point is why do we need to make Bucharest citizens to be active citizens? Is there any, I mean, how? So in fact, there are 2 questions. Sorry, Daniela. So one question has to do with this making people active. And why do we need to make citizens active? Is there any connection between socialism or /communism, the way people use the term, and non-activism? And the second question is, most blocks of flats built in socialist Romania are 60, 50 years old. So they are not very old if we think compared to other built environments. Do these buildings need to be cared in any way?
Okay, thank you, Gabriela, for the introduction. First of all, I will pick up right from a comment you made related to property. And I will add, well, I will start by saying that 99% of the apartments in Romania are privately owned. And it is important to say that because it sets a premise for both your questions. This is an image from the 60s, well, the end of the 60s, where this built environment was supposed to be the basis for a new built society. And it was the society of the brave, the strong, the fit people, and there was no room for aging, for vulnerability, for so when you talk about equality, I think reading through the texts and the discourses of those decades, there wasn't much room for people who were not the image of the new man. Working for the society and receiving back whatever he or she needed from that society. And now I think we, especially our generation, we have to watch our parents get old in the apartments where they moved. In many cases, they came from rural environments, from villages all over Romania, and they were put in an apartment on the 4th or 10th floor of a building. And of course, when we talk about aging, we talk about vulnerability. And now I will refer to especially to people and trying to think and well to make you imagine or maybe unveil some empathy for an old lady in her late 80s, let's say, living on the 8th on an apartment on an 8th floor, and having very, very little connection to her neighborhood, to the outer spaces of the building, and also to her neighbors. And this is actually one of the points that I want to make, that these buildings were meant to host people, but they don't have the prerequisite, what requires for communities to grow. And it was also one of the downfalls of communist lives and the securitate, let's say, and that feeling of always being watched and your neighbor being potentially in connection to the state and going against you to maybe tell if you think or act or say something against the regime. And this actually was a very strong seed for mistrust among neighbors. So if you are an old lady on the 8th floor of a building, it's very likely that you are alone and you don't have many connections to your neighbors. And I've experienced that, I've seen that, and I'm experiencing that with my own parents right now. It's a lack of community. It's already a very strong word. It's a lack of basic empathy and basic human connection inside a building. And I've seen that in many places where we've developed projects, that it takes an outside force to maybe bring people to meet, and it doesn't necessarily happen that people build networks inside a building. And last year with the pandemic, we saw that networks were more likely to be forged between or among several buildings than within one and the same block of flat. And this poses a problem, especially when you live in a landscape that is full of blocks of flats that are now being refurbished or let's say rehabilitated from a thermic with thermic insulation, but they are not also rehabilitated against the risk of earthquake. And this is a threat which is now being acknowledged in the public discourse in Bucharest, that many of these blocks of flats are in the peril of being demolished if we get another earthquake like the big one we had in 1977. This is a great risk. And another risk is, or another problem, is when you think that these buildings, even though they're not very old, the pipes are already starting to require to be changed. And action in, if I dare use a strong word, resilience, community resilience, in case of crisis, if we talk about earthquake, or resilience or everyday resilience, like just refurbishing your own apartment, or they both require concerted action. You need all the neighbors. At least if you want to change the pipelines, you need all the 11 neighbors living on the 11 floors of many buildings to come together, make a decision, and then act together. And this is not something that we see very often happening. And we don't have many programs. Well, we don't have any programs from the government or from the local authorities tackling this issue. And as coming back to the fact that 99% of these apartments are privately owned, the state has very little responsibility, well, has taken very little responsibility, and has little to no power to influence in the rehabilitation of these blocks of flats. And then we also think about what happens. Okay, we don't have an earthquake, but they maybe we might consider demolishing them. Well, this is another issue because most of them are in concrete. And as we know, even if you demolish a building which is made of concrete, you have a lot of problems that to deal with afterwards. So even if we keep the structure and we rearrange all the non-structural parts, then this also requires concerted action. So you need to have a sort of community and also public programs that support that. So I think that that's why you need to make people active. You need to make them aware of the fact that they have to work together with the neighbor, and also there is another idea which is left from the communist mindset, that the state is there to solve your problems. And even though the state should help you solve your problem, you should also take responsibility for your own life and for your own property, because owning your apartment is not just a right, it's also your responsibility towards taking care of that property. So to make this switch, we also have to to talk people into giving being aware of the importance of the built environment, and also being aware of the fact that their neighbor might need them, and that it might be not very difficult for a young person on the 3rd floor to care for a person on the 8th floor who is in need, rather than expect somebody from 3 blocks down the road or another city to come and bring some groceries in a case of a crisis like we've seen last year. So yes, these buildings, need to be cared for because they're getting old. It's it's not an absolute number. When you say we've had these buildings were built in the 60s or the 70s, when you have historic cities being built in the 17th century, and they are still up and running and being inhabited very, very decently. But these are buildings which have grown old, and and modern architecture actually does not age well. That I think we've now seen that, and these blocks of flats are even more vulnerable to that, although not as much as in France or Holland, but also in our case where they were made more with more durable materials. But we are seeing now that facades are falling down, and also pipes are breaking up. And the social mix that you were mentioning, and I think this is going to be my last point because I think I've exhausted my time. The social mix that you mentioned is still there to some extent, but it's also not acting and not bringing all the benefits of mixity. People are not aware of their neighbors and are not acting together, and the lack of trust is still there, and the lack of cooperation is in my opinion one of the major issues regarding these blocks of flats.
Thank you very much. I'm going to continue your presentation with mine. So I hope you can see. Yes. So thank you very much for your talk. I think I was very much inspired by what you said, that the word community is a powerful word, but sometimes, I think in many cases we don't see a lot of community work happening, a good quality community work, and this is something I have discovered while I was doing my own research in blocks of flats in Bucharest as part of the Disobedient Buildings project, funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council. When I've met one key participant, usually this is how I started in a block, and this person introduced me to others. Very often, these key participants were very reluctant to connect me with other people, even if they lived there for 30 years, 40 years. It's like, no, that person is not good enough for the research. And we know in anthropology, we know that sometimes, very often, this is also a way of saying, talk to me, don't talk to them. Our version of how we see the world is the good one. But I think it's more than that. It has to do with what you had said before. Lack of trust and lack of knowing others. And of course, things changed since communism. But that's also something that needs to be discussed. So I said before, my name is Gabriela Nicolescu. I work in this Disobedient Buildings project together with other people who do research in London, Inge Daniels, and in Oslo, Anna Ulrike Anderson. we look comparatively of how people live in blocks built in the 70s and 80s. For today, I chose to tell you the story of Miss Maria Gagea that you see here in the image. She's 93 years old, and she did not get out of the block for 3 consecutive years. I think when I asked her, you know, why not? She can walk, she can take care of herself, she cooks for herself, but still, you know, 3 years it's quite a considerate period. And before that, for the other 2 years, she only went out for 1, maximum twice a year. Her husband died 5 years ago, and very much she connects this fact that she feels secure in the block, and she doesn't feel secure to just go by herself. One of the reasons has to do with the fact that there are not enough benches to sit when she gets out. And another reason is that all the stairs at the entrance and, you know, all the infrastructure of the city is not ready and prepared for people who have disabilities. She moved in the block in 1979. At that time, she was a teacher. Her husband had a managerial position in the Ministry of Education. They have 2 children, and as all the people in the block, she bought this flat where she lives now, making a credit for the state company called ICRAL, which means the local construction company. So this local construction company did these flats. She bought them. She made this credit. They made this credit, and they managed to pay all the credits, all the entire mortgage up to 1989 at the end of the regime, of the communist regime. Before, she lived in a house with only 2 rooms. Now her daughter lives there in theory, because in practice, her daughter emigrated to the UK, where she works as a care worker. So it's very interesting that even if her daughter was trained into music, she was a very good piano player. In the flat of Miss Maria Gagea, I saw a very beautiful old piano, which is something that you don't necessarily find in communist blocks of flats. I thought it's interesting, this story is interesting because at a certain point last year, but even 2 years ago, she fell very ill, and for several weeks she laid in bed and she couldn't move at all. So because her daughter is away to take care of other elderly people around the world, and her son lives outside of Bucharest, she was cared by a neighbor of hers. And this good neighbor, she even bathed her, so the level of intimacy was so high. So in this, you know, context of lack of trust and not talking a lot with others, there are some bonds between neighbors that are very strong. But these bonds need to be discussed. So what is care in this context? I'm going to discuss a bit the way this Miss Gagea was cared by her neighbor, referring to some theorization and contextualization of the concept of care. In an article I have published in 2019 in the Journal of Anthropology and Aging, the article is called "Keeping the Elderly Alive, Global Entanglements and Embodied Practice in Long-Term Care in Southeast Italy." I tell the story of 3 Romanian migrant workers who live with Italian elderly. Basically, these people prolong the lives of the Italian elderly because they are so dedicated to these practices of care, and they are so interested into the economic benefits of keeping the elderly alive that they do whatever they can, even, you know, refuse to take holidays or ask for their children to come to Italy so that they are not, so that they don't break the relationship they build, a relation of care. But what care means, you know, it's not necessarily it's a combination of attentive practices and detachment in the case of these people, and even in the case of this neighbor that cared for her. It's not because they have a very good relationship, but because the neighbor knew to do some basic stuff with her and to manage to feed her 3 times a day and to bath her every several days. Yeah, so I think it's interesting that in the case of taking care of old people inside of the blocks, but also of the buildings in themselves, we need to I will refer to this definition of care as habituated action. Aulino, who is an anthropologist working on care as a ritual, said conceptualizing care as ritual allows us to pay attention to what caregivers do rather than just what they say they do. In doing so, we can productively explore care as habituated action separated from belief or internal orientation. In mundane everyday routines as a source of insight about care, we can observe better what counts as care. So I'm thinking very often with people and also with these buildings that that have been built in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Bucharest. People are reluctant to have these habituated actions and these. It's as if these standardized ways of taking care of the building, it's something that people need to be ashamed of, and actions taken together to manage to solve some problems that the entire community has. So what I want to say is that I think we don't need to romanticize what means to take care of people and buildings. We need to realize that there is also detachment, and there are also bad parts into taking care of people and buildings, but we need to take them into consideration and as a society, deal with them. At the end, I'm going to say something and in a way conclude referring back to Daniela's presentation. I think very often communist blocks of flats lack a concerted way in which people think at communal spaces. So this old person, Maria Gaja, doesn't manage to get out of the block. She doesn't have a wheelchair. If she would have a wheelchair, she couldn't use it because the staircase doesn't allow for wheelchairs to get in. But this doesn't happen only with the elderly. It happens also with younger generations, people having children and having buggies and not being allowed to get inside of the block. It's very difficult. I've seen mothers, with one hand holding the door, which is very hard because it's made out of metal, and with the foot keeping the small child and the buggy so that she manages to get in and bring them into the elevator. So I think more consideration given to communal spaces and how, together different generations can cohabitate in such buildings should be very beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. I think it was a really good way to complement Daniela's, let's say, broad landscapes of blocks of flats and the transformation that they were under from the construction until now, with a few very concrete and very empathetic case studies. Thank you. That was really interesting. Next, we have Iulia Stătică speaking. She is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Bartlett School of Architecture at University College London. Her work explores the relationship between political power and architectural form, and her current research project explores the links between gender, the post-communist state, and architecture in contemporary Bucharest. And she will tell us a little bit from this research project. You're muted, Iulia.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you are able to see my presentation. So I think it's interesting the way the discussion kind of unfolds with Daniela and then Gabriela's presentation about sort of from a larger scale of the city, and then with the study case and the question of empathy that are developed in Gabriela's work. I'm going to talk about, to even kind of linger a bit more onto this interior of the apartments. And I will be talking about the project that I currently develop at the School of Architecture at UCL, which is called Gender, Infrastructure and the Production of Domesticity in the Post-Socialist City. And I think it really speaks to this theme that Gabriela and Maria thought about approaching from the perspective of the relationship between the body and the interior space. One of the aspects of this research that I'm developing is a documentary that I've been working on along a colleague, a visual anthropologist, Adrian Câtu. So the documentary is titled My Socialist Home, and focuses exactly on this relationship between a body, especially women's body, and the interior of these socialist flats. It involved extensive fieldwork in Bucharest and interviews especially with women, and I was particularly interested in the manner in which political regimes orchestrate or alter this relationship, but also in turn how bodies are able to mediate domestic infrastructure and to appropriate them as effective grounds. And from a contemporary standpoint, whereby socialist blocs, like it was said before, represent extensive and long-lasting legacy. I think around perhaps more than 80% of Bucharest population still lives in these socialist blocs. I think it's important to speak to the question of temporality. That is material, that is embodied, that is intergenerational as well. And I think the question of intergenerationality, it's very important to be brought into question and to be theorized, to be thought through as well. Now, as a bit of a historical context from which my project starts from specifically, I'm very interested in the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, and especially the year of 1974, when the law of systematization went into effect, although many laws before had anticipated this transformation. This law radically transformed the face of Bucharest, really, breaking with the previous urban framework that was set before his regime, that was Soviet inspiration, but at the same time, and this is actually these are some images from my field work. This is a house that was demolished, is precisely due to this reorganization of the city. But what is especially peculiar in this time, so in the 70s, 60s, is the fact that this transformation of the home and of the way the city looked, it was paralleled by the growing body of the population, which became a political goal through a decree that was voted in 1966, pointing towards the politics of demography. The decree instituted the duty of a woman to give birth to at least 5 children before being allowed an abortion, which was otherwise criminalized. So in this context, women's bodies were appropriated in the social reproduction of socialism, while marking the importance of the home. And I think this also connects to what Gabriela was saying before about this idea was specifically envisioned for a young population. So, well, of course, the disabled, the elderly were almost never taken into consideration, were never included in this discourse of growth, of infrastructural growth, but also growth of the body. Now onto my focus. The interior emerged, the socialist interior more specifically, emerged as a space where the modern meets the rudimentary, the standardized furniture meets doilies, icons, and trinkets, and scientific living meets empathy and imagination. Although the ideological network enwrapped all aspects of everyday life, almost nothing was more saturated with ideology than the home. So the interior had thus the power to both domesticate the citizen and control interiority. So going back to the contemporary situation, these interiors become paradoxical because they contradicted this very standardized and sanitized way of living through precisely because of shortages of difficult legal frameworks as well that made interior a space not only of compliance but especially of finding your way through living in that time. Also the interior brings along interiority, establishing a relationship between the understanding of the self and the understanding of the home as a spatial construct as well. So the interior becomes an expressive space and locus of subjective and intersubjective interaction, whereby intimacy, care, imagination, gender, and intergenerational relations are shaped. The interior fosters a historical understanding not only of the body and the experience of domesticity, but also of the immorality that stemmed from the transgression of absurd limits imposed by legal frameworks, insofar as numerous recounts identify the space of the very home not only as a space for the care of the family, but also as a space for clandestine practices. And I'm specifically referring to the clandestine abortion that were performed in the interior of the flats in the context of the extreme legal frameworks that regulated women's bodies. Here again are photographs from personal archives of the subjects that I interviewed in Bucharest, and these specific set of photographs shows Magda, so my subject from the fieldwork, presenting photographs from 1984 to 1995 of her family, her 2 children, and back to last year's fieldwork in which Magda and her daughter are sitting in their transformed kitchen and adapted kitchen. So home becomes not only an affective space, but a mirror of the subject itself and of a temporal passage. I interviewed numerous subjects who granted me access to their apartments and life stories. So nevertheless, my interviewees spoke about the communist period from a post-communist condition. The distance that such methods entail speaks also to what our historian Georges de Huberman calls the impure temporality of our historical time and the intricacies of memory. And I think in this context, again, I come back to this idea of temporality that becomes essential to think through these stories and buildings. And I want to quote this from Huberman. He says about this historical time, this impure temporality, that and it's in this way that we must understand the survival of images, their fundamental immanence, not their nothingness, not their fullness, not their origins before all memory. not their horizon after all catastrophe, but their recourse, the recourse of desire and experience in the depth of our most immediate decisions, our most banal everyday life. So I was interested, and this is these are again this set of images of the life, let's say, the archival personal archives. This is of a Chilean refugee that came in Bucharest in the 70s with her family, and this is her apartment in the district Drumul Tabere in Bucharest. So I was interested in this fieldwork in achieving a sense of the home that suggests a temporality, not only in terms of its materiality, but also in connection to the body and to an affective transformation as well. The stories were in all instances built as an interlace between present lived experience and recounts of past experiences. I structured the fieldwork in what I called an archive of the home, that places the idea of temporality at the center of these complex relationships. And just to, I will finish just in a second. So this historical framework, and thus the newness of the then housing blocks, as well as the idea of youth and fertility that was embedded in their rhetoric, emerged today as an afterlife of that ideal. So my subjects who back then were part of this political ideal are mostly retired widows who live on their own. Aged buildings and bodies come together to speak otherwise, that is allegorically, about the phantasmatic past almost. The materiality of this apartment, still sunken in the aesthetic of the socialist regime, collapses with new forms of taste and tectonics that often function as reminders of their children and grandchildren, who in many cases I interviewed are living outside of the country. The interior is the main focus of the film and of the project as a whole, it gains a special status also insofar as it exerts an express influence on the individual, and at the same time it speaks about her, that is the woman, in a layered way. Yeah, so the project, I guess all projects or all perspectives kind of emphasize in this importance of ethnographic work in approaching not only buildings, but also the bodies that live inside, and what is the connection between aging, not only of the material as concrete, I guess in this case especially, but of the deterioration of the body itself and how that responds to the disintegration of the infrastructure that was back then imagined as a immortal project, as was imagined the woman herself, right? So yes, so that was my perspective on this really fascinating theme.
Thank you, Iulia, for such a rich and very visually compelling contribution. I really appreciate it. And I find it fascinating that as the talks come after one another, there are very clear themes emerging, both of materiality and temporality, like you say, and specific elements of transformation, but also in terms of community and trust. There are a couple of themes that I will also address in my next talk, and I'm really keen to also hear afterwards what Hannah thinks as a discussant. Now, as on a separate note, it's also quite funny to think that I myself am now in Drumul Tabere, where a lot of your work was situated. I don't even live in Bucharest. I live in Piatra Neamț, and I will tell you about Piatra Neamț, or I lived in Piatra Neamț, and now in my travels, I find myself in one of your key field sites. So that is quite a good, let's say, ethnographer's overlap. So as follows, I will tell you a little bit about the work that I mentioned. So I've conducted long-term ethnographic fieldwork inside a block of flats in Piatra Neamț. The fieldwork started in 2014, but it lasted for about a year and a half. But ever since I have returned very regularly, also because it is my own hometown, as I mentioned. And even now I have arrived in Bucharest after 2 weeks where I spent quite a bit of time seeing my family, but also catching up with research participants. And also with this roundtable in mind, I was surprised to see just how many conversations ended up at the topic of care towards themselves, their family, their apartment, their building, and the genuine, let's say, challenges in sustaining a good life, especially in the context of the pandemic, which has overemphasized a lot of the issues that we've heard, particularly trust, and we can get to that in a little bit. So I haven't prepared slides, but I would like to show you a fragment of my film and bring you in with me in the building that I studied, the building that was made in 1974. And I will bring you into a small room that is the Inhabitants Association space where people meet. And I've spent quite a few, I've been to quite a few of these meetings over the year, and I have found it a very productive, let's say, well, as you say in anthropology, a liminal kind of interstitial space from which to look both inwards at the apartment, at these very intimate spaces that you and Gabriela have described, but also broadly that look outwards towards the city, but also, let's say, even more so towards the nation state in terms of care. So what I will, the key of what I want to contribute with today is in a way resonating with Gabriela was talking about, that care is not romanticized. I would go even further in my particular example, that sometimes care comes with conflict. It comes with tensions, and care has to kind of impose itself in the conditions in which, like some of you have also mentioned, the state is no longer caring for the inhabitants as it used to. Yeah, so for instance, you'll have quite a few contributions in the anthropology of infrastructure that speaks of this care at the level of housing, at the kind of grand scale. You'll have a lot of literature, for instance, especially feminist literature, looking at the care inside the apartment. But what I'm seeing is this very big tension. And the tension is played out in the room that I will share with you in the film. And the tension is the following. On the one hand, you have a shrinking city, like many small and let's say middle-sized cities in Romania, whereby a lot of the inhabitants are gone, they've emigrated. You also have an aging city where a lot of the inhabitants, as you'll see in this fragment, are aging. Some of the people in the film have actually passed away since 2017 when I edited the film. And this kind of tension is very important because with very limited resources, let's say a small pension or a small salary, people have to care both for themselves and for the common good. And this is a very concrete way of, let's say, negotiating these interdependencies that are so common in urban life, yeah? So we'll talk a little bit about how individuals care for their apartments, sure. But more broadly, this is a very good lens into dealing with broader uncertainties of this rapid kind of changing post-socialist society that all of you have mentioned. So without further ado, I will share just a couple of minutes and then I will come back to the commentary. Now, before I start the film, I would like to, let's say, to fine-tune your attention towards the issue of social condensers or social mixers that you Daniela, brought up at the beginning. And a lot of you have mentioned trust, suspicions, or different communities. So please pay attention to how people describe each other as they're waiting for the meeting to start, sorry. So now I will share my screen. Oop. Can you see? Yeah, good. And we're now in the block of flats.
Aici, am spus și repede, am spus în caz că cineva e cu bătaia, eu... Aici. I-am spus Raica, Da, dar nu știu, nu, Raica în sensul că știu cine, dar nu știam ce să vă spun, de-aia am ezitat puțin.
Gata, ai recoltat totul.
Tot. Știți cum e treaba aia. Eu plec strugurii, fac vinul, am pământul an de an, știu ce gust are vinul. Eu nu-ți goier, eu sunt țăran.
Eu dacă știam că vine așa pe sezonul meu, aduceam și pe nevastă.
Asta e numărul.
Dar cel puțin 5 în casă care fost, da, 6 chiar. Dar știți, domnul Vasile, știți dumneavoastră cum e. Dar lăsați că ne descurcăm. Cel mai bine când trecea un băiat așa de până în 40 de ani, eu eram pe aici, pe culoare. Și faceți cum? Păi zic, uite, ai citit o de zi, așa de. O tot spatele, dacă una de
Da, e de-a nostru sau e unul de ăsta care e dispozitiv de aici?
Nu-i băiat rău, dar uite că a zis, măi, sunt mai răi ca tine. Că eu nu las, că mi-am pus termometri, dacă mai vrei ceva, îmi pun și de ăla de care se sude.
Stați în casă cu temperatura.
Controlul, unde ești, mamă?
Am programat pentru seara aceasta o întâlnire frumoasă cu dumneavoastră, urmărim două lucruri foarte importante. Pe de o parte, faptul că suntem obligați, conform legii 230 pe 2007, spre toamnă, așa să facem o întâlnire cu niște teme foarte clare și pe care o să le spun. Trebuie să vă spun de la început, chiar mulțumesc la cei mai mulți care sunt oameni foarte serioși, că pe ansamblu suntem cea mai bună asociație la plăți. Dar să știți că de 3 ori pe săptămână eu iau balanța analitică. Știu tot timpul să mișcă. Intrări și ieși de jumătate. Și bineînțeles că mă vedeți pe aici ca multe culoare, că ce facem bun? Păi mai discut cu oamenii, ca să adună. Uite, ieri am depus la bancă, la Caseria Centrală, 28 de milioane. O asociație mică. Bun. Dacă mai o să aveți și alte cu privire la trecerea iene, în rest, trebuie să avem siguranță la plăți, trebuie să avem tot timpul situația gazului metan pe toate ramurile, trebuie să avem foarte clar situația la energie, trebuie să avem situația la apă, că apa e foarte scumpă. Am și eu un pic de contribuție, am făcut niște emisiuni la televizor și am spus că apa trebuie să scadă prețul, nu să crească. Au fost întrebate oameni.
I'll stop here. I just wanted to bring you into the space that I mentioned earlier and to reveal with you some of the key themes that have proven to be quite relevant during my research. If you give me just 1 second, my computer just got stuck. There we go. Okay, I can see you again. So you heard at some point, for instance, that he talks about the way in which he analyzes the registers and he knows everything that's flowing. So there's a huge, he really ran a very tight ship. So from the financial contribution of every inhabitant who had to pay for heat, for water, etc., to the technical flow of, let's say, of the heating unit that he had built as an engineer and that he was taking care of. Daniela, you mentioned the pipes. He had raised money from everyone to change the pipes. He had even rehabilitated the building thermically without the contribution from City Hall, but by calling people who were abroad to convince them to contribute to make sure the whole building is insulated. So this huge effort was very obvious to me. But what was fascinating is that there was a kind of tension, like I mentioned earlier. As you saw at the beginning, when people were waiting to go in, he tells the story of a young man who didn't want to be involved, but also who didn't have time. He kind of grew up and he was active most of his life in a very different society from the one that his neighbors were living in. he actually had the time to deal with these things, whereas a lot of his younger inhabitants could hardly make ends meet and didn't have the same kind of ability. And what was fascinating to me is to see how a neighbor will then ask, is he one of us? And by is he one of us, he's mostly referring to the community of people who lived them from the beginning. And as they passed away or as they moved, but mostly passed away, people, when they came to Piatra, they typically stayed in Piatra. There was a kind of schism between this kind of old guard who was keeping things together, but they themselves were having all sorts of health issues, and this kind of new wave of people coming into the building, as you would imagine. So what I wanted to highlight today is this kind of great effort that's being put into stabilizing a material order, basically in order to stabilize a social order, and the close interdependence between these two. And just as, for instance, in the literature, we talk more and more about the fragility of infrastructural systems, and there's a kind of counterpoint of the fragility of the human bodies. Here it is exactly at this junction that people put most effort and time into. And I found it very telling, for instance, that at some point in the middle of a conversation about the hardship of all these financial gymnastics that he had to put into things, he said, this block is 40 years old. All the equipment, whether we like it or not, is also 40 years old. It's the life of a man, 40 years. So we have to find a way to understand, to educate, to know. What do? Do we fix it or do we leave this place? So he had very much the spirit of the kind of active inhabitant, active citizen in a way that was mentioned a little bit earlier. But with that came a great deal of suspicion and of tension. For instance, the hardship that was encountered when raising money for all these maintenance issues. Earlier in the film, there's a moment when Mr. Bud tried to raise money to fix the stairs at the entrance. And I have heard so many conversations about those bloody stairs. People were really unhappy that on top of everything, they had to fix the stairs. But sometimes they would put money in a pot for the maintenance of the building, and the money wouldn't add up. So that would increase the suspicion, but it wouldn't add up because very often Mr. Bud would save some of that money and, for instance, give it to a family who had just lost a family member towards the cost of the funeral. So these financial gymnastics are much more subtle, and these are the kinds of threads that I wanted to highlight. And as a final idea that I would like to contribute towards our conversation is also something that was touched upon earlier, namely that some of these efforts are simply not visible. Yeah, so it is very easy to be suspicious of what is visible or what is perceived when you don't have very close relationships. But the issue of visibility also links to that of responsibility that at some point some of you have brought up. So one particular example is fixing the attic, which is above the building. Yeah, but in a context in which everyone is the owner of their own apartments, I found it incredibly interesting to see what kinds of discussions people were having in order to convince the person on the second floor to fix the rooftop that mostly affected people on the 12th floor. And the invisibility of this kind of inner work and the subtleties of it. And as a way of concluding, this kind of contributes to the idea that care in this particular instance, and I think in many others, is not this kind of soft, warm, fuzzy feeling that is often portrayed, but it is often very tense, very suspicious, it is very annoying, it is very effortful, and it is always, I think, worth it. But it does not go without saying that these buildings will be cared for and that the people inside of the buildings will be cared for. So that was my contribution. So thank you for hearing me out. And now I would like to pass the word to Hannah Knox, who will be our discussant. Now, Hannah is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCL. Her work explores in an ethnographic manner really varied topics such as risk and responsibility, territorial politics, expertise, knowledge and technology. And more recently, she finalized a project on the politics of energy and climate change in Manchester in the UK. And this resulted in a brilliant book with Duke University Press called Thinking Like a Climate. So I'm really keen to kind of zoom out from Romanian blocks of flats and to see what you think about care and aging and the built environment, perhaps even in relationship to climate. So welcome, Hannah. Oops, that was my timer.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Maria and Gabriela, and thank you to all of you for such amazing, wonderful presentations. I feel like I've been completely privileged to get a real kind of in-depth insight into Romanian life, to aspects that, as someone who doesn't work on Romania, things that I knew a little bit about, but I just didn't understand a lot of the kind of relationship between the political history of Romanian building and the lived experience of being part of that changing political history. So it's been a real privilege to be able to listen to these papers. I think a few words to begin with just on the way in which I've been listening to them, and the kind of framing in terms of my own previous work, which has been around how we can attend to and engage with infrastructures as social formations. And for a long time, I've been really interested in trying to think about how infrastructures become ways of mediating social experience, but trying to describe that in a way that doesn't overemphasize the deterministic effects of infrastructure on social experience. I think it's really interesting that we've got anthropologists and architects here in the same space discussing these issues, because I think we've really kind of come together around a shared set of problematics, but I think the disciplines often take different starting points about the role of the academic in the process of description versus the process of design. And I think this question of the relationship between infrastructure and social life or social experience is really kind of entangled in where one starts. So in my own work, I've thought about this in terms of questions of affect. So I worked on, before doing the work on climate change, I looked at road construction in the Peruvian Andes, and there I found the notion of affect really helpful for understanding how people experience politics through a really intimate engagement with the materiality of infrastructure. And I definitely felt that came out through lots of the discussion today. But also questions of how ideas get and particular kinds of preoccupations get built into the design of infrastructure, how as anthropologists we can deal with the variety of ways that the same kind of infrastructural forms might manifest in different kinds of places, and also the question of a counter politics. So how does one resist the design of the infrastructure? I think that also came through. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the themes that really struck me from the papers that were the talks that were given today. So in the first talk, the first thing that really I was completely kind of taken by and really fascinated by, Daniela, was the way that you really evoked the kind of ambitions of the kind of modernist design of these housing blocks, and particularly your use of the terminology of things like the new man, and the way that a particular idea about the kind of person who would live in these places was really inscribed into the design of them. And I think this really opened up for me questions not only about aging, but also other issues that have came out in later talks, about questions around the implicit kind of gendering of buildings and the way in which they include and exclude particular kinds of people. And I think this opens questions as to kind of what possibility there is, and I think you're all probably engaged with this literature, but in bringing feminist approaches to bear on these socialist architectures, to think about their material impact on people's lives. I'm also was very taken by the idea of design that came across in your work, and the notion of activism, and I heard a very strong kind of ambition to engage people more explicitly in activist processes. And I think what I really wondered about there was how you see an attention to materiality and infrastructure as having a capacity to activate kind of the political imagination among the people who you're working with and talking to. So one of the kind of real value, I think, of infrastructure studies has been that it has shown that politics doesn't just take place in a discursive register, but it takes place in the mundaneity of engaging with material artifacts and the complex ways in which they appear and are argued about and kind of unsettle people's relations. And so I was really kind of taken by, and I'd love to hear more about how you see that activism kind of really grounded in the buildings themselves and in the way in which they're structured. In Gabriela's paper, I think here there's a really interesting set of questions that Gabriela's asking about how the question of care gets actually built into the design of the flats themselves. So I heard in this talk a story about a person who is experiencing life in these flats as a kind of rather isolated experience, an experience where I think you said her own daughter had moved out of the country and was caring for other people in other places, and that she was experiencing care through other people in this particular environment. And this really made me sort of wonder about the question of what care is and who does the work of caring. So I think in a lot of the papers we heard about the state as a potential source of care and how that is difficult and often quite compromised within the Romanian context, where relations with the state have been entangled with ideas not only about care, but also about surveillance and about responsibility. But I also started to wonder what role the building itself was playing as an agent of care for someone like the lady that you were talking about, because you talked about the building as a safe space, as somewhere which she felt that in one respect she couldn't leave from, but also that she had chosen not to leave from. And this also got me thinking about the concept of familiarity and whether there's any purchase in the idea of familiarity as a way of thinking about care. So I was thinking about the family relations themselves as one register within which care is taking place. But in your example, the family member is no longer there. So but I also kind of heard in what you were saying that there was something about the very familiarity of the building, that there was a safety within that kind of longevity of experience of the building. And I wondered if something around the idea of familiarity might be a concept that could link across these very different kind of practices of care and as a different kind of language. And I think you were talking about care as ritual and as habituated action. I thought those were very suggestive, but I kept kind of coming back and thinking about the idea of the familiar and what role that plays. In Iulia's paper, I really felt that this paper introduced to us really key questions around power. So I heard in your paper a description about the way that power is enacted, not only through modernist kind of forms of planning, but the way in which it acts on the body itself. And I think that came through really, really clearly. And when you were talking about female bodies and the reproductive body and the way in which the state actually has a kind of very tangible and direct effect on women's own agency for their own reproduction, and how that gets played out through a tension between the interior space of these domestic settings, which people craft into their own kind of imaginaries of what it means to be a particular kind of self, and an imposed kind of modernism that creates these spaces as another kind of space of transgression or space of politics. I was really interested when you talked about the home as a temporal passage, and I wondered about the relationship between political temporality and personal temporality and how that played out in your work. And I was really fascinated. It would be wonderful to hear, as you talked to people about the archives of photos. I would love to have heard more about what people say about how they narrate those photos and how the entanglements between the personal and the political get narrated by people or not, as they talk about these photographic archives which you've collected, which I think, just as an aside, are a completely wonderful thing to have kind of gathered and to be able to share with us as a part of your research project. I thought they were really, really amazing. And I suppose my last question that I had from the presentation that you gave was, I think you gave a really strong sense of how relations between people are are kind of made to endure over time, and the way that these archives index and describe the endurance of relations over time. And it made me wonder whether we could think anew about how buildings endure over time or not, by paying attention to these practices and forms of endurance that enable social relations to endure over time. So we tend to think about aging buildings as buildings that are decaying or that aren't enduring, but maybe this draws attention to the work that's done to make them endure and make them have a presence over time. And then we come last to Maria's talk, which is also wonderful. And I probably know more about Maria's project than any of the others before, but it was really lovely to see an excerpt from the film and to hear again about the project that she's been doing for many years in the film that she's made. And I think in Maria's paper, I was really kind of struck by the articulation of her project as a focus on the relationship between the care for the self on the one hand and the care for the common good. And that came across, I think, in all of the presentations today, that people are struggling with this question of the care for the self and the care for the common good. And what I really took from these 4 papers is that that's not a new problem. That's something that people have been thinking about and working on, particularly in the socialist and then post-socialist context of Romania. And it made me think, though, as well, that it's also something that's very present in discussions about questions like the Anthropocene and climate change, which is what I've been working on recently, which are equally cast in the register of, you know, does one make a decision about your own personal life and your personal social relations, or are you acting for the greater good? And it really, I really felt that from these papers we could take kind of insights from how people have negotiated these tensions within the Romanian context to really bring that back into these contemporary conversations about climate change and the Anthropocene. And I think that one of the things that really struck me from Maria's paper is that I wonder sometimes whether the language of care does need to be somewhat disaggregated. So when you were talking, Maria, about the idea of kind of care for family or care for people, whether that was equivalent to the way that the idea of care is evoked at the level of the state. And I know that you're interested in the state, and you yourself use the language of responsibility. And I wonder if care and responsibility are really the same thing, or whether actually it's better, whether actually it's useful to kind of pull care and responsibility apart as different, really different kinds of activities, and to think about what the relationship between care and responsibility is. So I think those were the kind of main kind of things. There were such rich papers, so a huge amount to kind of think about, which I'm going to take away with me. But just to say thank you again for sharing with me your work in Romania, and I found it really fascinating.
Thank you, Hannah, for such a thoughtful and close reading of each of the contributions. I thought that was brilliant. I wish we could have this every day on all the topics we work on. I'm really grateful for the attention and the level of detail, but also the time you took to kind of unpack each of the issues and each of the contributions as a whole. So I would like to invite the others to, if they would like to respond to some of your comments. And as you gather your thoughts, I can briefly mention something about my paper, kind of beginning with the end, if you'd like. And I completely agree with you. And this is that actually care and responsibility, or the different kinds of care, whatever is discursively titled care, is in practice something of a different nature. But what I found fascinating, for instance, also going through, let's say, the archives of the Romanian the Romanian state archives, or the local newspapers, or even magazines, let's say women's magazines from the 80s, is that the language that was used was that of care, of a kind of either paternalistic care of the state or maternalistic care of the woman in the house, but it is something that is very different. So I really welcome your encouragement to try to pull them apart and to look at them through a kind of anthropological let's say, lens. If anyone else would like to respond to Hannah's commentary, we have a couple of minutes left. Say about 5 minutes for discussion. Please feel free to take the floor. Gabriela, your microphone is muted. I think you were trying to say something.
Yes, hello. I was trying now to find a quote from Peg Rose where she was talking about care. I can't find it now, but she was saying something in relation to care and architecture. And she was saying that when we discuss in terms of care, we need to take this humble position and to kind of withdraw from positions of power. And I think it's a very interesting quote because it's a provocative quote especially for the Romanian context. In a way, I associate in my previous work with museums and the way institutions function during socialism/communism, the way people use the term in Romania, very often with the concept of care, because the socialist system cared for its citizen, wanting to build so many blocks, and in theory pretended to distribute wealth through schools, education for many, through hospitals, etc. But there is a tension also in how historically this happened. Very often, and not very often, but in many cases by demolishing houses to build blocks. And you think in terms of property, people have been taken from their houses to move into the blocks so that many more could afford living. So there is a tension here. In terms of familiarity, it's interesting, those people who came from what the socialists called bourgeois background, aristocratic backgrounds, they didn't find themselves familiar in the block of flats. But those who came from smaller cities or who came from the rural side of Romania and who felt that they were at the first generation in the city, they had all these bonds of familiarity. That is one important aspect. And I think the other aspect that has to do with time passing is the fact that, the way the solidarity functioned during socialism, it's something, that has been noted, but once the system changed, when the political and economical system changed and we switched from socialist state into capitalism, very often those who had social mobility and economic mobility managed to move from certain blocks and to go into better off locations. That means houses or villas, but even blocks in the city center. And very often in southern part of Bucharest there are blocks with aging populations, those who didn't manage to move. And then again, there is not so much familiarity into these newcomers and the ones from the previous generation. I think, thank you very much for your comment, Hannah. And I think the Romanian case is an interesting case, hopefully not only for Eastern Europeans, but also for many other people who do research and are interested and fascinated by blocks of flats and socialist buildings around the world.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Iulia and then Daniela, very briefly.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your thoughtful and very interesting questions that you raised. And I guess your two main comments, one of them was related to this idea of buildings as being able to endure, right, over time, and then this question of archival images that I gathered through my fieldwork. And I think that these two actually are entangled. So there are, because the question of endurance, of buildings endurance, it's very much connected to the idea of care. The flat was in all of the cases the most I guess, long-standing object, I would say, or I don't know, entity that was throughout their lives. All people that I interviewed had lived in these flats from the 70s, so until the present. And the question of archive, this archive of photos, maybe connects to that. In the way that there is a sort of nostalgia, but at the same time, in many cases, there is a critical stance. One of the interviewees, for instance, it was just the second time that I met her. She said she wanted to make this point, telling me that, you know, these photographs that I showed you yesterday are just a glimpse of happy moments, but then it was very hard. Everything was very hard. We're referring to the previous regime, for instance. And then it all was related to this trauma of her house being demolished. And so I guess it's very specific to the subjects that I've been talking to. Yes, and very nuanced as well. So there are many layers in this attitude, I guess. All right, I don't want to take too much time, but I guess just a few words.
Thank you so much, Iulia. Daniela?
Okay, thank you so much to all of you. I was the first one, and I think I was the most privileged to listen to all your contributions, and thank you, Hannah. I just to wrap things up real fast. I will, based on my experience and from my research as well into this community organizing and building, which is a very new activity in Romania. It started after 2007, especially, well, 2009, 2010. And the first communities were being organized by community organizers. There was an NGO which still exists in Bucharest, and now for the past 5 years, maybe, we've started seeing local initiative groups which are self-organized, and I think this is a huge step in our society, where people actually come together, realizing by themselves that they need common action. And what's interesting is that some of the local initiative groups that I know, one was created by moms who wanted a better park for their children. Another one was created against a dumping ground because of the nuisances, like the smell, the odors brought people together to fight against that. So we see people coming together for public things or common things, common threats or big issues that they feel they have the possibility to engage with. I think what we're trying to connect in our work is that middle ground, like also the connection between the park and the flat, not just the flat and the park. So it's not just the big public spaces, the big community infrastructure, but also the street, the staircase. So these are not as researched yet, at least not by architects in Romania, and this is a very fertile area. So yeah, thank you also for your thoughts.
Thank you, Daniela. I think this is a brilliant place to end, kind of forward-thinking and optimistic, and I also know and appreciate these Bucharest initiatives very much. Thank you everyone for such a generous spirit and for your interesting contributions. Thank you, Hannah, for discussing the paper so thoughtfully. And thank you, Gabriela, for being a lovely co-organizer.